Okay, I'm just going to show you how to use pivot tables. So I've got a data set here. This is from my current account. And as you can see, the columns are date, transaction, credits, and debits. So I'm going to go insert pivot table, and then I'm just going to choose the data set that I want to feed that pivot table. And then down here, I'm going to choose the output cell where I want the pivot table to go. Click OK. There's a pivot table canvas or basic template. As you can see, those 4 columns are represented in the pivot table fields box, and I'm going to drag the credit one down into the values section, and that will count the number of credit values in my data set, which is 5. I'm going to right click there, value field settings, and change to sum, and that'll give me $1,900, 1922, which is the sum of my credit values. I'm also going to drag down debits, 36 transactions, that's the count. Right click and change to sum, 1400. So just as a double check here to show you what's going on, I'm just going to sum the column. Debits sum up to 1400 and credits to 1900, so you can see it's matching up there. Okay, now I'm going to take date and pull it down into the rows area of the pivot table, and now each date is represented once in the pivot table, and it'll give you the sum of credits and the sum of debits occurring on that date. So for the 4th of June, I can see I've got a few transactions there summing up to that value down there, which matches 60.54. So let's get rid of the date and instead pull down transaction into the row section of the pivot table. Now I'm getting each transaction represented once and the sum of all values under that transaction in the data set. As you can see, the total's still matching up there. And this list is a bit shorter than the list in my data set. So what I've done here is I've pulled transaction into the count area, and I'm seeing a count of the transactions, how many times that's occurring. So this Macy's one's occurring 4 times according to a pivot table. So let's just look at the data set. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the 4 times it's occurring. And so you can see the count there. If I was to sum it up, it would equal the sum 100.78 for debits. Just a shortcut, you can double click on the number 4 there in the pivot table and it spits out this sheet which gives me all the detail behind that number. And you can do that with any pivot table number just to see the background data. So let's get rid of the count of transaction, and let's get rid of transaction as well. And what I want to do is get a more summary view. So I'm going to create codes for each transaction in my data set. I'm creating a new column here called AC type, account type. And I'm just going to go through each transaction and code it as food or basics for that Macy's groceries one, depreciable assets for the next one, recreation for that restaurant, and so on. So I'm going to code them all. Just quickly do that. That was a shortcut. I did that already. And now I've got an extra column in my data set, but if we look at the pivot table, you can see that column's not represented here. So what I need to do is I need to amend the base data set for my pivot table to include that extra column that I just created. So what I've done is I right click on the pivot table, got to analyze, change data source, and make the data source encompass column E. And now you can see AC type is in my pivot table. And if I drag it into the rows section, you can see the pivot table now has AC type there, and the totals still match, and it's summed up everything in between. So now I'm just taking transaction down, and actually you can see that under each AC type you can see all the transactions that make up that AC type and their breakdown of debits or credits. You can switch the order around, which I've done here. I'm just changing the pivot table options so that it shows the old style pivot table. Instead of staggering the totals, it puts them side by side. I'm just going to right click and uncheck subtotals to get rid of the subtotals. So let's just switch it the other way around again. And now I'm going to get rid of the transaction, and the last thing I want to do, well, not the last thing, the next thing I want to do is to summarize by week commencing. So instead of having every single date in the month there, I just want to have 4 weeks. And to do that, I'm just going to write a quick formula that just translates each of those dates into the Monday that that date relates to. Doesn't matter how you do this, as long as you get a week commencing date in column F there. So now I've got this week commencing column. I just need to do the same thing and add it to my pivot table cache. Analyze, change data source, and extend the data source to column F. And there it is. It's in your pivot fields dialog box there, ready to use. So I'll get rid of AC type and pull week commencing into the rows, and you can see you've got a summary by week there of credits and debits. Now finally, the last thing I want to do is add a cash flow column to my data set and add that to the pivot table. So I'll just call it cash flow, and it's simply equals credit minus debit. So then you just have like a cash flow for each transaction. And if I go on my pivot table, I can just right click on the table and click refresh, and because that AC type is in column E, which is between the existing columns, I don't need to extend the data source. It just appears there when I click refresh. So now I'm going to drag cash flow down into my values section, and it's summed up the cash flow. And as you can see, for each row there, for each week, we have credits minus debits equals cash flow. So I'll get rid of the credits and debits fields, and I'm going to pull week commencing into the columns area, so it'll split it over each column, and then I'm going to pull AC type into the rows section, so that's split over rows, and now I've got my nice aggregated summary. I'm just going to change the value to show negative values as minus red, get rid of the decimals, and that's the end result. And that's my basic intro to pivot tables, just to get you going.